Ever heard about a powerful ruler who was really smart and changed a lot during their time in charge, but then is mostly remembered for like a crazy made-up story about them and a horse?
Mm.
Well, that's what happened to Catherine the Great,
Wow.
this Empress of Russia back in the 1700s.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to be looking into today in this deep dive.
Well,
We're
okay.
going to try to separate fact from fiction and really figure out who this woman was, behind all the myths.
It's amazing how that one kind of scandalous rumor like just took over everything and overshadowed, a time when she was ruling filled with all this political maneuvering and cultural changes and even a real interest in those Enlightenment ideas.
Yeah, it makes
Yeah.
you wonder how history can get so twisted, especially when we're talking about powerful women.
Yeah.
It's almost like some people just couldn't deal with a woman having that much power, so they had to come up with these outrageous stories
Absolutely.
to, like, discredit her.
And it makes us think twice about just believing everything we hear about history. We really got to look past the gossip and explore all the different sides of Catherine's life to understand her true legacy.
Okay, so let's start from the beginning then, Catherine. She wasn't just born, with a crown waiting for her, right?
Not at all. She started as Sophie, a German princess kind of overlooked by her own mother, who was very ambitious and really favored her brother.
Oh, wow.
So it wasn't really a fairy tale start.
So then how did she go from being this almost forgotten princess to the Empress of all of Russia?
It's a great story, really full of ambition, strategy, and a little bit of luck.
Yeah.
Empress Elizabeth of Russia was looking for the perfect bride for her nephew, who would become Tsar Peter III, and she saw Sophie.
Mm-hmm.
Empress Elizabeth thought Sophie would be a good way to solidify the Romanov dynasty.
Okay, so Sophie, this kind of minor princess, suddenly finds herself thrown into this world of Russian royalty.
Right.
I bet that was a huge culture shock.
It definitely was, but Sophie was incredibly adaptable, unlike her future husband, Peter. You see, Peter didn't like anything Russian. But Sophie, on the other hand, she jumped right into Russian culture. She learned the language perfectly and even converted to Russian Orthodoxy.
That's a pretty smart move. It
Yeah.
seems like she really knew how to win over the Russian people, something that Peter totally missed.
Exactly. And that difference would play a huge role in how Catherine eventually rose to power their marriage, though that's a whole other story, a total disaster right from the start.
Oh, wow.
Peter was often described as childish, fixated on military toys, just the opposite of Catherine, who really wanted a son, political security, and intellectual stimulation.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Catherine needing an heir to secure her place. The pressure from Empress Elizabeth and Peter just completely oblivious to it all.
It was a very complex web of power dynamics. Just imagine the pressure Catherine faced, never knowing whether Empress Elizabeth would be pleased with her or scold her for not producing an heir.
Yeah.
It was a constant game of court intrigue. She always had to be one step ahead.
So how did she handle all of that?
With patience, strategy, and some cleverness for years, she endured Peter's indifference, the constant scrutiny of the Empress, and even isolation because Elizabeth had spies planted all around her.
Really?
It was a real trial by fire.
So did she ever manage to have a son?
Well, after 9 years of this turbulent marriage, Catherine finally gave birth to a son. Paul. Peter's immaturity and his obsession with those military toys probably played a role in the delay.
Okay, so after all that tension, an heir is finally born. What happens next?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. Empress Elizabeth dies, and Peter takes the throne as Tsar Peter III.
Oh.
And just as Catherine suspected, he turned out to be a terrible ruler.
What made it so bad?
Well, he alienated the military by forcing them to adopt Prussian-style uniforms and drills, just completely disregarding their traditions.
Oh, wow.
He also made the public furious by undoing Russia's hard-won victories in a war with Prussia, all because he favored Germany, and on top of that, he openly disdained the Russian Orthodox Church, which didn't win him any favors with religious leaders.
It's like he was almost asking to be challenged. Was Catherine just watching this happen?
Not at all during her years as the Grand Duchess. Catherine had been busy building relationships with powerful military figures.
Yeah.
Some accounts even describe her riding through military barracks on horseback, charming the soldiers and presenting herself as this approachable and engaging leader.
That's smart. While Peter was busy playing soldier, she was building a power base.
Exactly. And those alliances would be crucial when the time came after just 6 months of Peter's disastrous rule. Catherine, with the military support, staged a coup.
Wow.
It happened surprisingly easily, which really shows Catherine's strategic brilliance and Peter's complete incompetence.
Wait, she overthrew her own husband? That's incredible. Was there any resistance?
Surprisingly, little Peter got a lot of warnings about the coup, but he just ignored them, choosing to play his violin instead.
What?
By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. Catherine, riding on horseback with the military leaders beside her, had already secured the capital.
That's amazing. It sounds like something out of a movie.
It was a bold move, showing both Catherine's strategic thinking and Peter's complete detachment from reality.
So what happened to Peter after the coup?
He was captured and died a week later. Officially, it was an undiagnosed injury, but a lot of historians believe he was assassinated.
Wow, a dramatic end to a short and troubled reign. So Catherine the Great takes the throne. What does she do with all this new power?
Well, this is where we get into the complicated part of Catherine's rule, a time of contradictions and a balancing act between idealism and pragmatism. On one hand, she was a true admirer of Enlightenment ideals, committed to modernizing Russia and supporting the arts and education.
We have some more information about her reign in the sources you provided.
Oh, great. Let's take a look.
They highlight specific achievements, like her vast art collection and the cultural renaissance that she fostered. She sounds like a true patron of the arts.
Right.
It's fascinating how someone who came to power through such upheaval could also be a champion of progressive thought.
Her intellectual curiosity and desire for progress were undeniable. However, this is where we encounter one of the most significant contradictions of her rule, her inability, or perhaps unwillingness, to dismantle the brutal system of serfdom.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
How could someone so forward-thinking in so many ways still support such an oppressive system?
It's a question historians are still debating today.
So Catherine the Great, the Enlightened Empress, was also a supporter of serfdom.
Yes.
It's hard to reconcile those two sides.
It's a stark reminder that even the most progressive figures of the past can be entangled in the ethical dilemmas of their time. Remember, Catherine came to power with the support of the nobility, many of whom depended heavily on serf labor.
So was it a matter of political expediency?
Perhaps.
Was she truly opposed to serfdom, or did she simply see it as a necessary evil to maintain her power?
It's difficult to say for sure. Some historians argue that she planned to gradually abolish serfdom, but lacked the political capital to push through such sweeping reforms. Others suggest that her commitment to Enlightenment ideals was ultimately overshadowed by her pragmatism and desire for stability.
That makes sense. It's one thing to have ideals, but another thing entirely to implement them when you're dealing with deeply entrenched power structures.
Precisely. Catherine's reign illustrates the challenges of enacting meaningful change even when you hold the highest office in the land. It's a dilemma that resonates even today.
Absolutely. We see this all the time, even in our own lives.
Right.
Wanting to do the right thing, but often finding ourselves stuck in systems that make it difficult.
Think about the complexities of ethical consumption, the impact of our choices on the environment, the intricacies of global supply chains.
Right.
It's a reminder that Catherine's struggles weren't confined to 18th century Russia. They mirror the challenges we face in navigating a world where our ideals often clash with the realities of power and economics.
It's a sobering thought, but it also makes Catherine's story feel more relatable. She wasn't this perfect, untouchable figure.
Right.
She was grappling with real problems and making difficult choices, just like we do.
Exactly. Humanizing historical figures, acknowledging their complexities and contradictions, allows for a much richer understanding of the past.
Okay, so we've explored Catherine's rise to power, her embrace of Enlightenment ideals, and her complicated relationship with serfdom. What about those outrageous rumors, particularly the infamous horse story? Where did those come from?
Well, those rumors have a fascinating backstory, revealing much about the power of propaganda and the deliberate attempts to tarnish Catherine's legacy. It all starts with her son, Paul.
Ah, right. The son she waited so long for. What role did he play in all of this?
Paul harbored deep resentment toward his mother. He felt overshadowed by her power and blamed her for his father's demise. Once he ascended to the throne, he actively sought to undermine her legacy, contributing to the spread of negative narratives.
That's quite a family drama on such a grand scale.
Mm-hmm.
A son trying to dismantle his own mother's reputation.
It really speaks to the enduring power of family dynamics, even within the highest echelons of power. Paul's actions demonstrate how historical narratives can be shaped by personal grudges and political agendas.
So Paul starts sowing the seeds of these rumors. But what about the broader context? Was there anything else happening at the time that might have fueled these negative portrayals of Catherine?
The timing of Catherine's later reign and Paul's ascension coincided with a pivotal event, the French Revolution.
Ah, that makes sense. The French Revolution sent shockwaves throughout Europe. How did that impact Catherine's image?
The French Revolution ushered in an era of intense anti-monarchy sentiment. Propaganda machines went into overdrive, churning out pamphlets and cartoons aimed at discrediting monarchs and the aristocracy. Catherine, despite her initial support for Enlightenment ideals, became a prime target, especially after withdrawing her support for the revolution once things turned violent.
So she became a symbol of everything the revolutionaries despised, even though she had, in some ways, been sympathetic to their cause.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how historical figures can get caught in the crossfire of shifting political tides, their legacies distorted to fit the narratives of the moment.
And this is where the horse story really takes hold.
This is where the historical meme machine, if you will, goes into full swing. The story of Catherine's death by a falling horse, fabricated decades after her actual death from a stroke, became a potent tool for discrediting her, playing on pre-existing anxieties about female sexuality and power.
It's almost absurd when you think about it. Who comes up with this stuff? But I suppose it was effective in its time.
The story was deliberately crafted to dehumanize Catherine, portraying her as a monstrous, insatiable figure. It was meant to shock and disgust, reducing her to a caricature defined by a single fabricated incident.
It's incredible how a simple, salacious story can have such a lasting impact on someone's historical reputation. Why do you think this particular rumor stuck? What made it so potent?
Several factors contributed to its staying power. Firstly, it tapped into deep-seated anxieties about female sexuality, particularly the idea of women's desires as something dangerous and uncontrollable. Secondly, it played on existing stereotypes about powerful women as being inherently corrupt and immoral.
So it's not just about a horse. It's about using that image to reinforce pre-existing biases and fears about women in power.
Precisely. The horse story becomes a shorthand for dismissing Catherine's achievements, reducing her to a caricature.
It's a stark reminder of how gender dynamics can influence the way history is written, and how easily women's accomplishments can be overshadowed by fabricated scandals.
It's a phenomenon that transcends Catherine's story. Think about the countless women throughout history whose legacies have been tarnished by similar tactics, smear campaigns, baseless rumors, and the deliberate distortion of their accomplishments.
It's a pattern that's sadly familiar even in our own time.
Absolutely. The horse story serves as a cautionary tale, urging us to be critical consumers of historical narratives, particularly those that reinforce harmful stereotypes.
It's a call to dig deeper, to question the accepted narratives, and to recognize the ways in which power dynamics shape the stories we tell about the past. We've covered a lot of ground in this conversation. We've explored Catherine's rise to power, her complex relationship with Enlightenment ideals and serfdom, and the origins of the infamous horse story.
We've unpacked a great deal about Catherine the Great, but her story is far from simple. There are many other fascinating layers to uncover.
Indeed. But before we dive into those layers, I think we need to pause and take a moment to process everything we've learned so far.
Catherine's story really makes you think about how we judge people from the past, especially those who had a lot of power.
Yeah, it's tough, right? It's tempting to judge them based on what we believe today.
Right.
But we have to remember the world they lived in.
Exactly. We have to consider what they were up against, the limitations they had to work within, and all the choices they made, both good and bad.
So in Catherine's case, it seems like she actually believed in those Enlightenment ideals.
Yeah.
But she was also practical, willing to compromise to keep her power and do what she thought was best for Russia.
Her reign was this constant balancing act between ideals and real-world politics. She had to juggle her intellectual goals with actually running a huge and complicated empire.
So how do we ultimately judge Catherine the Great? Was she a feminist icon, a flawed but effective ruler, or something else entirely?
That's what's so interesting about history. It doesn't fit into neat boxes.
Yeah.
Catherine was complex. She was all of those things and more.
She was a woman who defied expectations, grabbing power in a world ruled by men and staying in charge for over 3 decades.
And she was a supporter of the arts, a reformer who modernized Russia in many ways, and a skilled diplomat who expanded her empire.
But she also allowed a system of brutal oppression to continue. She didn't get rid of serfdom, even though she seemed to be against it intellectually. That's a tough thing to overlook.
It reminds us that even people we admire can have flaws, and those we might condemn can have good qualities too. History is rarely black and white.
It sounds like her story is full of contradictions, reminding us that historical figures were real people with complicated motives, strengths, and weaknesses.
It's a far cry from that one-dimensional image we get from the horse story and other rumors that have been around for centuries.
Yeah, those stories driven by political agendas and sexist stereotypes, they really keep us from understanding the real Catherine, her intellect, her ambition, and the struggle she faced as a woman in power.
It shows how important it is to think critically about historical narratives.
Yeah,
We need to question our assumptions, look at things from different angles, and be careful about stories that simplify or twist complicated figures, especially those that reinforce harmful stereotypes.
so what can we as individuals in this world, overflowing with information, learn from Catherine's story?
Catherine's story highlights the importance of being critical about how we understand history. We should question assumptions, seek out different perspectives, and be wary of stories that oversimplify or distort complex figures,
Right.
especially those that reinforce harmful stereotypes.
It's about understanding how power dynamics shape the stories we tell about the past, and remembering that history is often written by the winners or those in control.
It's about accepting nuance, acknowledging that even those we admire can be flawed, and those we might initially judge can have redeeming qualities.
It's realizing that history isn't just a collection of clear-cut heroes and villains.
Right.
It's a messy, complicated, and ultimately human story.
And Catherine the Great, with all her contradictions, represents that messiness and complexity perfectly. She was a product of her time, but she also went beyond it in many ways.
She definitely left a lasting impact on history. We've talked about her rise to power, her complicated relationship with Enlightenment ideals and serfdom, and the origins of that infamous horse story.
We've covered a lot.
But there's still so much more to explore.
Indeed, we could dive into her foreign policy, her influence on the Russian Orthodox Church, or the long-term effects of her reforms.
Her reign was a turning point in Russian history, shaping the country for centuries to come.
And her story still speaks to us today, offering insights into the complexities of power, gender, and the lasting appeal of historical myths. It reminds us that the past isn't really over. It shapes who we are today.
Before we move on to those other fascinating aspects of Catherine's reign, I think it would be helpful to revisit something you mentioned earlier, the importance of critical thinking when engaging with historical narratives. You mentioned that we need to be wary of narratives, especially those that reinforce harmful stereotypes. What did you mean by that?
Well, look at that horse story we talked about. It wasn't just some silly rumor.
Yeah.
It shows a lot about how stories from history, especially about powerful women, get twisted and changed to fit certain agendas.
You're right. Horseback riding was seen as pretty masculine back then, and Catherine was known to be a really good rider.
Exactly.
It's almost like they took something, she was great at something that showed her strength and ability, and turned it into this awful and demeaning story.
Exactly. It's taking something that showed how capable she was and twisting it to make her look bad. It's a classic example of using someone's sexuality to discredit and dehumanize them.
Right.
Especially women who dared to challenge the way power worked back then.
It makes you think about how many other historical stories have been changed by misinformation and attempts to control how we see the past.
It's a challenge for everyone, not just historians, to be critical of the information they come across. We need to question the sources.
Right.
Think about the motivations behind the stories and look for evidence that challenges what we're being told.
Especially these days when information, both true and false, spreads so quickly. It's more important than ever to think critically.
We need to be careful, use our judgment to separate fact from fiction, and challenge stories that reinforce harmful stereotypes. It's like being a detective putting together the truth from a bunch of clues and conflicting reports.
You're right. It's about digging deeper, asking tough questions, and being willing to challenge what we've always been told, even if it's been around for centuries.
Right, and sometimes those investigations lead to some uncomfortable truths.
Yeah.
But that's the power of history. It makes us confront what we believe and deal with the complexities of human nature.
Well, I think we've done a good job of debunking that horse myth and showing a much more interesting and complex picture of Catherine the Great.
I agree.
She was brilliant, ambitious, definitely ruthless at times, but also a product of her era, navigating a world where power and morality were often in conflict.
She wasn't perfect, but she wasn't a monster either. Just a human being trying to make her mark on history for better or worse.
And in the end, it's up to each of us to decide how to weigh her achievements against her failings, knowing that history rarely gives us easy answers.
So the next time you hear someone tell that ridiculous horse story, I hope you'll challenge them to look a little deeper to discover the real Catherine the Great, a woman of contradictions, a ruler who broke the mold, and a figure whose legacy continues to spark debate and fascination centuries later.
Well said. It's been a really insightful conversation. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the life and legacy of Catherine the Great.